But let us now turn to serious matters. The Treaty of Lunéville had been followed by the Peace of Amiens, which ended the war between France and England. The first consul resolved to take advantage of the calm in Europe and the restored freedom of the seas to send a large corps of troops to Saint-Domingue, which he wanted to wrest from the domination of the black forces commanded by Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint, though not openly rebelling against the metropolis, displayed great airs of independence. General Leclerc was to command the expedition. He was capable and had fought well in Italy and Egypt, but his chief distinction was that he had married Pauline Bonaparte, sister of the first consul. Leclerc was the son of a miller from Pontoise, if one can call Miller a wealthy owner of immense mills engaged in considerable commerce. This Miller had given a brilliant education to both his son and his daughter, the latter of whom married General Davout. While General Leclerc made preparations for departure, the first consul assembled in Brittany the forces destined for the expedition. Until the day of embarkation, these troops were, as usual, placed under the command of the General-in-Chief of the Army of the West, Bernadotte. It is well known that there was always great rivalry between the troops of the Rhine and Italian armies. The former were very devoted to General Moreau and disliked General Bonaparte, whose rise to head of government they had witnessed with regret. For his part, the first consul had a great preference for soldiers who had fought with him in Italy and Egypt. Although his antagonism with Moreau was not yet openly declared, he understood it was in his interest to remove as many units loyal to Moreau as possible. As a result, the regiments selected for the Saint-Domingue expedition were almost entirely drawn from the Army of the Rhine. Separated from Moreau, these troops were pleased to find themselves in Brittany under Bernadotte, a former lieutenant of Moreau who had almost always served on the Rhine with them. The expeditionary force was to be increased to 40,000 men. The Army of the West itself counted a similar number. Thus, Bernadotte, whose command covered all departments from the mouth of the Gironde to that of the Seine, temporarily commanded an army of 80,000 men, most of whom were more attached to him than to the head of the consular government. Had General Bernadotte possessed more resolve, the first consul might have regretted giving him such an important command, for, as I can say today as a historical fact and without harming anyone, Bernadotte conspired against the government headed by Bonaparte. I will provide details of this conspiracy that are all the more interesting because they have never been known to the public, nor perhaps even to General Bonaparte himself. Generals Bernadotte and Moreau, jealous of the first consul's elevated position and dissatisfied with the small role he gave them in public affairs, had resolved to overthrow him and place themselves at the head of the government, alongside a civilian administrator or an enlightened magistrate. To this end, Bernadotte, who had a particular talent for winning the affection of officers and soldiers, toured the provinces under his command, reviewing troops and using every means to bind them more closely to him. All kinds of flattery, money, promises of promotion, everything was used with the subordinates, while in secret he disparaged the first consul and his government to the officers. Once most of the regiments were disaffected, it became easy to push them toward revolt, especially those destined for the Saint-Domingue expedition, which they viewed as deportation. Bernadotte's chief of staff was a brigadier general named Simon, a capable man but lacking firmness. His position enabled him to correspond daily with regimental commanders, and he used this to make his offices the center of the conspiracy. A battalion commander named Fourcart, whom you knew in old age as a poor assistant librarian for the Duke of Orléans, a post I secured for him out of pity for his 30 years of misery, was then attached to General Simon, who made him his principal agent. Fourcart, traveling from garrison to garrison under the pretext of official duties, organized the secret league, which included nearly all the colonels and many senior officers who were incited against the first consul by accusing him of aspiring to royalty, which, it appears, he had not yet considered. It was agreed that the garrison of Rennes, composed of several regiments, would initiate the movement, which would spread like wildfire through all army divisions. A regiment was needed to be the first to act and inspire the others, so the 82nd Line Regiment, commanded by Colonel Pinoteau, was brought to Rennes. Pinoteau was a capable, very active and brave man, though somewhat excitable despite his outward calm. He was one of Bernadotte's protégés and a leading conspirator. He promised to make his regiment, by whom he was well loved, declare itself. Everything was ready for the outbreak, when Bernadotte, lacking resolve and wishing, in true Gascon fashion, to pull the chestnuts from the fire with the cat's paw, convinced General Simon and the main conspirators that it was essential he be in Paris when the fall of the consuls was proclaimed by the army of Brittany, so he could immediately seize the reins of government in concert with Moreau, with whom he was going to confer. In reality, Bernadotte wished not to be compromised if the plan failed, but to benefit if it succeeded. General Simon and the other conspirators were blind enough not to see through this ruse. The day of the uprising was set, and the man who should have led it, having prepared it, cunningly removed himself. Before Bernadotte's departure for Paris, a proclamation addressed to the French people and the army was drafted. Several thousand copies, prepared in advance, were to be posted on the day of the event. A Rennes bookseller, initiated into the secret by General Simon and Fourcart, undertook to print this proclamation himself. This was sufficient for swift distribution in Brittany, but Bernadotte also wanted a large number of copies in Paris to spread throughout the capital and all the provinces as soon as the army of the West revolted. Fearing exposure by using a Parisian printer, Bernadotte found another way to obtain many copies without compromising himself. He told my brother Adolphe, his aide-de-camp, whom he had just appointed lieutenant in the Legion of the Loire, that he authorized him to accompany him to the capital and advised him to bring his horse and carriage, as the stay would be lengthy. My brother, delighted, filled the carriage trunks with various belongings and entrusted the vehicle to his servant, who was to travel slowly while Adolphe went ahead by coach. As soon as my brother left, General Simon and Commander Fourcart, delaying the servant's departure under some pretext, opened the trunks, removed belongings, replaced them with packets of proclamations, closed everything up again, and sent off poor Joseph, who had no idea what he was carrying. Meanwhile, the first consul's police, becoming increasingly organized, had caught wind of some plot within the army of Brittany, though without knowing the details or who was behind it. The Minister of Police decided to alert the Prefect of Rennes, Monsieur Mounier, a renowned orator of the Constituent Assembly. By a very strange coincidence, the prefect received the dispatch on the very day the conspiracy was to break out in Rennes during the noon parade. It was already 11:30. Monsieur Mounier, given no specific information by the minister, thought it best to question the chief of staff in the general's absence. He asked General Simon to visit the prefecture and showed him the ministerial message. General Simon, believing everything had been discovered, lost his head like a child and confessed to Monsieur Mounier that there was indeed a vast conspiracy in the army, in which he had unfortunately taken part but now regretted. He then revealed the entire plan, named the leaders, and added that within minutes the troops assembled on the parade ground would, at Colonel Pinoteau's signal, proclaim the fall of the consular government. You can imagine Monsieur Mounier's astonishment, especially as he found himself in a delicate position with a guilty general who, though flustered, might regain his composure and remember that he commanded 80,000 men, of whom 8 to 10,000 were even then gathered near the prefecture. Monsieur Mounier's position was most critical. He extricated himself with great skill. General of the Gendarmerie Virion had been tasked by the government with forming, in Rennes, a corps of foot gendarmes, for which each regiment of the army had contributed a few grenadiers. These soldiers, lacking cohesion among themselves, were therefore beyond the influence of the line army colonels, and recognized only the orders of their new gendarmerie superiors, who themselves, according to regulations, answered to the prefect. Mr. Mounier immediately summoned General Virion, instructing him to bring all the gendarmes. However, fearing that General Simon might change his mind and escape to take command of the troops, he appeased him with kind words, assuring him that his repentance and confessions would mitigate his fault in the eyes of the first consul, and persuaded him to hand over his sword and to allow himself to be taken to the Labat Tower escorted by the foot gendarmes arriving in the courtyard at that moment. Thus, the chief instigator of the revolt was imprisoned. While this was happening at the prefecture, the line troops assembled at the parade ground, awaiting the hour of the parade, which was to coincide with the revolt. All the colonels were in on the secret and had promised their support, except for that of the 79th, Mr. Goddard, who was expected to follow the movement. How the fate of empires hangs on trivialities. Colonel Pinoteau, a firm and resolute man, was to give the signal, which his regiment, the 82nd, already drawn up in formation on the square, awaited impatiently. But Pinoteau, in concert with Foursart, had spent the entire morning preparing the distribution of proclamations, and, in his distraction, had forgotten to shave. Noon struck. Colonel Pinoteau, ready to go to the parade, realized that he hadn't shaved and hurried to do so, but while he was performing this task, General Virion, escorted by a number of gendarmerie officers, burst into his room, had his sword seized, declared him under arrest, and had him taken to the tower, where General Simon was already held. Had there been only a few minutes' delay, Colonel Pinoteau, at the head of 10,000 men, would not have been deterred by the capture of General Simon, and would certainly have carried out his plans to revolt against the consular government. But, taken by surprise by General Virion, what could he do? He had to yield to force. Following this second arrest, General Virion and the prefect dispatched an aide-de-camp to the parade ground to inform Colonel Goddard of the 79th that they had an urgent message for him from the first consul. As soon as he arrived, they informed him of the discovery of the conspiracy and the arrest of General Simon and Colonel Pinoteau, urging him to join them in suppressing the rebellion. Colonel Goddard agreed, returned to the parade ground without revealing anything, commanded his regiment from the right flank, and led it toward the Labat Tower, where he joined the battalions of gendarmes guarding it. There, he also found General Virion and the prefect, who distributed cartridges to these loyal troops, and they awaited further developments. Meanwhile, the officers of the regiments stationed on the parade ground, surprised by the sudden departure of the 79th, and puzzled by Colonel Pinoteau's delay, sent someone to his quarters and learned that he had just been taken to the tower. They were also informed of General Simon's arrest. The shock was great. Officers from the various corps gathered. Commander Fourcart proposed marching immediately to free the two prisoners and then carry out the planned uprising. This proposal was enthusiastically received, especially by the 82nd, who adored Pinoteau. They rushed toward the Labat Tower, but found it surrounded by 4,000 gendarmes and the battalions of the 79th. The attackers were indeed more numerous, but they lacked cartridges, and even if they had them, many would have been reluctant to fire on their comrades merely to bring about a change of leadership in the existing government. General Virion and the prefect addressed the troops to urge them to return to duty. The soldiers hesitated. Seeing this, none of the leaders dared give the signal for a bayonet charge, the only remaining course of action. Gradually, the regiments dispersed, and each returned to its barracks. Commander Fourcart, left alone, was taken to the tower, along with the poor printer. Upon learning that the uprising had failed in Rennes, all the officers of the other regiments of the Brittany army disavowed it. But the first consul was not fooled by their protests. He hastened their embarkation for Saint-Domingue and the other islands of the Antilles, where most met their deaths, either in combat or from yellow fever. As soon as General Simon made his initial confessions, and even before victory was certain, Mr. Mounier sent a dispatch to the government, and the first consul debated whether to arrest Bernadotte and Moreau. However, he postponed this action due to lack of evidence, but in order to obtain some, he ordered that all travelers from Brittany be searched. Meanwhile, good Joseph arrived calmly in Versailles with my brother's cabriolet, and was greatly surprised when he was seized by gendarmes, who, despite his protests, took him to the Ministry of Police. Naturally, upon learning that the vehicle driven by this man belonged to one of Bernadotte's aides-de-camp, Minister Fouché had the luggage opened and found it filled with proclamations in which Bernadotte and Moreau, after speaking very harshly of the first consul, announced his fall and their own rise to power. Bonaparte, furious with these two generals, summoned them. Moreau said that, having no authority over the Brittany army, he disclaimed all responsibility for the conduct of its regiments, and indeed, this argument had merit. But it worsened the position of Bernadotte, who, as commander-in-chief of the assembled troops in Brittany, was responsible for maintaining order among them. Not only had his army conspired, but his chief of staff had led the plot. The rebel proclamations bore Bernadotte's signature, and over 1,000 copies had just been seized in the cabriolet of his aide-de-camp. The first consul thought that such clear evidence would overwhelm and expose Bernadotte, but he was dealing with a triple Gascon, thrice cunning. Bernadotte feigned surprise and indignation. He knew nothing, absolutely nothing. General Simon was a scoundrel, as was Pinotto. He dared anyone to produce the original proclamation signed in his hand. Was it his fault if some lunatics had printed his name on a proclamation that he vehemently disavowed, along with the guilty authors of these plots, whose punishment he demanded first and foremost? In fact, Bernadotte had carefully orchestrated everything through General Simon without giving him a single written word that could implicate him, reserving the right to deny everything if the plot failed, and Simon ended up accusing him of involvement. Although the first consul was convinced of Bernadotte's guilt, he only had partial evidence, which his council of ministers did not consider sufficient to justify an indictment against a general-in-chief whose name was very popular in the country and the army. But no such leniency was shown to my brother Adolphe. One night, he was arrested at my mother's home, at a time when the poor woman was already overwhelmed by grief. Mr. de Canrobert, her eldest brother, whom she had succeeded in removing from the list of émigrés, was living peacefully with her when, having been reported by some police agents as having attended meetings aimed at restoring the old government, he was taken to the Temple prison, where he was held for 11 months. My mother was doing everything she could to prove his innocence and secure his release when another terrible tragedy struck her. My two youngest brothers were being educated at the Prytanée Français. This institution had a vast park and a beautiful country house in the village of Vanves, not far from the banks of the Seine, and during the fine season, the students went there for short holidays. Those who had behaved well were allowed to bathe in the river. One week, due to some schoolboy mischief, the principal deprived the entire college of the joy of swimming. My brother Theodore was passionate about the activity and resolved, with some classmates, to enjoy it secretly. While the other students played in the park, they slipped away to an isolated spot, climbed the wall, and under a blazing sun, ran to the Seine and jumped in, still drenched in sweat. But they had barely entered the water when they heard the college drum signaling dinner. Fearing that their absence from the refectory would give them away, they hurriedly dressed, ran back, climbed the wall again, and arrived breathless just as the meal began. In such conditions, they should have eaten little or nothing, but schoolboys take no precautions. They devoured their food as usual and soon became seriously ill, especially Theodore, who developed a chest infection and was brought home in a desperate state. It was while my mother was running between her dying son's bedside and her brother's prison that her eldest son was arrested. What a terrible situation for a mother! To complete the tragedy, poor Theodore died. He was 18 years old, an excellent young man, as gentle in character as he was handsome. I was heartbroken upon hearing of his death, for I loved him dearly. The successive misfortunes that overwhelmed my mother increased the sympathy felt for her by my father's true friends. Foremost among them was the good Mr. Defermont. He worked almost daily with the first consul and rarely failed to intercede for Adolphe, especially on behalf of his devastated mother. Finally, General Bonaparte replied one day, "Although I have a poor opinion of Bernadotte's judgment, I do not believe him so devoid of sense as to involve a 21-year-old lieutenant in a conspiracy. Moreover, General Simon has stated that he and Commander Fourcart placed the proclamations in young Marbot's cabriolet. Therefore, if he is guilty, it is only slightly so, but I will not release Bernadotte's aide-de-camp until the general himself comes to request it. Upon learning of Bonaparte's decision, my mother rushed to Bernadotte to beg him to make the request. He solemnly promised, but days and weeks passed without action. Finally, he said to my mother, "What you ask of me is very difficult. No matter. I owe it to your late husband's memory and the affection I have for your children. I will go to the first consul this very evening and stop by your house afterward. I am certain that I will finally be able to announce your son's release." One can imagine my mother's anxious wait during that long day. Every passing carriage made her heart race. 11 o'clock struck, still no Bernadotte. My mother then went to his house and learned that General Bernadotte and his wife had just left for the Plombières' baths and would not return for 2 months. Yes, despite his promise, Bernadotte had left Paris without seeing the first consul. My distraught mother wrote to General Bonaparte. Mr. Defermont, who had agreed to deliver her letter, was so outraged by Bernadotte's behavior that he couldn't help but tell the first consul how he had treated us. General Bonaparte exclaimed, "That's just like him." Mr. Defermont, Generals Mortier, Lefebvre, and Murat then insisted that my brother be released, arguing that if the young officer had been unaware of the conspiracy, it was unjust to keep him imprisoned, and that if he had known something, one could not expect him to accuse Bernadotte, his commanding officer. This reasoning persuaded the first consul, who freed my brother and sent him to Cherbourg to join the 49th Line Regiment, no longer allowing him to serve as Bernadotte's aide-de-camp. But Bonaparte, who had his own mnemonic system, likely engraved in his mind the words Marbot, aide-de-camp of Bernadotte, Rennes conspiracy, and my brother never regained favor with him. A while later, he was sent to Pondicherry. Adolphe had spent a month in prison. Commander Fourcart remained there a year, was dismissed, and ordered to leave France. He took refuge in Holland, where he lived miserably for 30 years on the earnings from French lessons, being completely without means. Finally, in 1832, he decided to return to his homeland, and during the siege of Antwerp, one day, an old, shabby schoolteacher walked into my room. It was Fourcart. I recognized him. He admitted he didn't have a single penny. I couldn't help, as I offered him some help, reflecting philosophically on the strange twists of fate. Here was a man who, in 1802, was already a battalion chief, and whose courage and talents would certainly have made him a general, if only Colonel Pinoteau had not thought to shave just when the Rennes conspiracy was about to unfold. I took Fourcart to Marshal Gérard, who also remembered him. We presented him to the Duke of Orléans, who kindly gave him a position in his library with a salary of 2,400 francs. He lived there for about 15 years. As for General Simon and Colonel Pinoteau, they were sent to and held on the island of Ré for 5 or 6 years. Eventually, Bonaparte, now emperor, released them. Pinoteau had been living quietly in Ruffec, his hometown, when in 1808 the emperor, on his way to Spain, stopped there to change horses. Colonel Pinoteau boldly presented himself and asked to return to service. The emperor, knowing he was an excellent officer, appointed him to command a regiment, which he led admirably during the Spanish campaigns, eventually earning the rank of brigadier general. General Simon was also reinstated. He commanded an infantry brigade in Masséna's army when, in 1810, we invaded Portugal. At the Battle of Busaco, where Masséna made the mistake of launching a frontal assault against Lord Wellington's army, positioned on a steep, difficult-to-access mountain, the poor General Simon, eager to redeem his reputation and recover lost time for advancement, bravely led his brigade, overcame all obstacles, scaled the rocks under a hail of bullets, broke through the English line, and was the first to enter the enemy's fortifications. But there, A point-blank shot shattered his jaw just as the second English line counterattacked and drove our troops back into the valley with heavy losses. The enemy found the unfortunate General Simon lying in the redoubt among the dead and dying. He barely resembled a human being. Wellington treated him with great respect and, once he could be transported, sent him to England as a prisoner of war. He was later allowed to return to France, but his terrible injury prevented him from serving again, and the Emperor granted him a pension, after which nothing more was heard of him. That concludes the 17th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.